So welcome back. Let's take a wider look at whether more needs to be done to tackle radicalisation in this country. Now, the man arrested on suspicion of murdering MP Sir David Amess was detained by police under the Terrorism Act on Friday. Police has since been granted a warrant of further detention, meaning that he can be questioned until this coming Friday. But it does open up a conversation on terrorism and surveillance of those linked to terror known to the police. I'm joined by Alan Mendoza, the director for the Henry Jackson Society, a transatlantic foreign policy and national security think tank. So, Alan, first of all, staying with the details of this sort of exact case, how big is the problem of terrorism and radicalisation in the UK?
Well, it's of course a major issue, but in this case we're still uncovering the facts, of course. What we do know is that this is now a terrorism investigation as opposed to merely a murder investigation. This wasn't necessarily a surprise to anyone who, once the identity of the attacker became, or the alleged attacker became known, because it was obvious that this was going to be a case, given the Somali heritage, it was going to be a case, in that case, of being linked to some extremism potential. So I think everyone understands where this is going. We'll have to wait for it to unfold a bit more. But what it once again shows is that we're not really tackling this subject effectively. And I think it's very interesting that if you've looked at the commentary on this case so far, it's been heavily about, are we protecting our MPs enough? It's been heavily about, are we doing enough to promote civility in politics, as if this was the reason why Sir David was murdered. But it's not. Sir David appears to have been murdered in the name of an extremist ideology, most likely radical Islam, and we're not talking about that. And that's part of the problem, I think, with how we tackle this going forwards.
But in dealing with that, radical Islam, it's very difficult to kind of tackle that. And how do you get to the source of it? It seems to be like a serpent with lots of different heads. So you might slash one head, but then there's another one coming and there's a different extreme, and it's very fractious.
Well, absolutely. And here's where you get into the nitty-gritty of policy. It seems to me over the last 5 years, and I think it's interesting that you can date this almost back to the last murder of an MP by an extremist, which is, of course, Joe Cox, who was murdered by a far-right-wing extremist, that there's been a move in government to look away from, say, radical Islam and instead focus on far-right-wing terrorism. Constantly we're hearing far-right-wing extremism, etc., is the biggest threat to this country.
That's what we do here.
We're hearing that constantly, despite the fact the stats do not show that. If you look at the people under surveillance in this country, it's still radical Muslims who comprise the largest number, but you wouldn't know it, judging by what you've heard over the last few years. Number of plots, etc., have been on that side of the debate. So the first thing we need to do is be honest with the British people about what's going on today, still, when it comes to the threat of terrorism and where that's coming from. Yes, there's a far-right extremist element, but the biggest threat remains radical Islam. And then that takes you in, well, what can we do about it? Now, if you think about it, the end point of this, the actual act of terrorism, is not where you want to be tackling this. You want to be starting at the supply side, basically, i.e., how do we go back to first principles and how do we stop this ideology from spreading? And that's where the government has to start focusing attention on, going back to basics, basically, and saying, we understand there's a problem, we're going to tackle it, and we're going to go back to tackling at its core, which is how do we take on this ideology?
Well, we thought we would try that and go to Afghanistan, but it turns out that a lot of the terrorists are actually homegrown. So you're saying go back. How far do we go back? Where do we go back to, and what do we do when we get there?
Well, here's where it becomes interesting when it comes to looking at how you deal with radicalisation in this country. So you're right, this is not a phenomenon that's coming from abroad. Again, we don't know the details of this particular case, but past cases we've seen people have been radicalised in religious institutions, in educational settings, or of course online. And particularly, you know, if you think about the last 2 years, there's largely been a virtual existence for many people. And as a result, we've had no idea about what's been going on in the online space, people radicalising. Now, those could be people in the UK radicalising others, it could be people out of the UK radicalising others. So there is this question of the paths to this. But the second question is, what is it that drives someone like this attacker to go out and murder? Or the murder of Joe Cox. What is it that drives them to go out there? There's something that's made them angry about something in our society, if you like. They want to overturn that in some way, shape or form. So we have to go back into the root causes of why this is happening. And what is it about the ideology they are subscribing to that makes them think, I can go and kill in the name of a cause or in the name of God, as far as I think it's the appropriate phrase. So we've got to go back to that, understand the ideology and start to break down the integration issues that are clearly failing with people like this.
But it seems like a very long-winded approach. I hear you, but you know, when you have people like that sort of knocking about, it's going to be pretty difficult to stop this, isn't it? Isn't it nigh on impossible? So is it not a good idea to start looking at how we can protect ourselves from this?
Well, no, that's entirely the wrong approach.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously you have to look at protection issues, but that's the wrong way to look at it. If you're saying, basically, we're not going to try and change you...
Well, we should try and change it,
living in this country, I want to make clear. Here's where we have to look at this in a different way. I don't think you've got any ability to influence what might be happening abroad in this area. And certainly you have no ability, for example, in a case of radical Islam, you've got no ability to either opine or to make judgments on Islam. So you get people all the time saying, this is not an authentic version of Islam. Well, I'm sorry, people have got no ability to say that unless they happen to be Muslims and unless they can quote scripture in a scriptural battle against this, because it's not for non-Muslims to make that assessment, basically. It's for Muslims to debate and discuss. And we can't, as non-Muslims, we cannot, even the British state, cannot enforce what version of Islam we like. What we can do, though, is go into communities and make sure that those who are preaching extremist versions of a religion are not allowed to spread that openly, publicly, or even privately.
Well, they'll do, but okay, so they can't do that, and we do try and do that anyway. The police force, there's the prevent strategy, there's loads of different things that we try and do.
But are we doing enough?
Well, I don't think we are, but the other side of it is then you've got the internet side of it, and as I spoke to Chris Storr QC, he said that pretty much those tech companies are abroad, so we have no jurisdiction in enforcing anything. So it feels like we are at a loss to actually try and control this.
Well, there are actually plenty of things you can do on the online side as well. But let's just focus 1 second on the examples at home. A few years ago, there was a very significant review, if you like, of integration in this country called the Casey Review. It was done by Dame Louise Casey, and now Baroness Casey, who produced this report looking at what was happening in various cities and towns in the UK when it came to integrating people. And she discovered shocking results. She found that in certain cases, in various ghettoised areas, 75% of the inhabitants thought they were living in a Muslim country. That's Britain, by the way, not elsewhere.
Really?
You go back and look at it,
Wow.
the Casey Review.
Wow.
So, and she put forward a number of examples for how we can go into communities and start bringing back British values and British sort of ways of existence into these places. Recently, Ed Hussein wrote a book about what he had seen going around various Muslim communities in the UK, where he found wide-scale, what he would term extremism, occurring in British Muslim communities.
Well, this would be almost like, I mean, Trevor Phillips had that whole thing about multiculturalism.
Yes,
it doesn't
absolutely.
seem to be working. And I would agree with him, it's not working because different communities come together, but then they stay within their communities, and it almost becomes ghettoised in a sense that they are small communities and elements can be in poverty, but they are isolated from the main environment.
That's exactly, the isolation factor is what both Ed Hussein and Dame Louise Casey put out here. Of course, this is not to say for a moment that there is a uniquely Muslim problem. You have other examples in this sort of way, and nor will you be saying that most Muslims are like this, but clearly there is a specific problem here of radicalisation in Muslim communities that lends itself in the end to violent attacks in a way that doesn't happen with other religions. So there is something there that we need to understand and we need to look at, and part of that has to be with what you just said about isolation and a lack of integration. Now, if you're able to change that from the point of view of the British state, you have at least a possibility of making inroads and making sure that people are not subjected to extremist views that can then lead into extremist violence as a result of that. And we have to go back to that review and say, why was it never implemented? It's not been implemented. It's sat on the shelf. It's sat on the shelf, and it has not been implemented. We should go back to that as a matter of course. MPs should go, we need to look at this once again and come back and look at the measures there to make Britain, if you like, a more integrated and cohesive country, which I think all of us wish to see. And I think it's very interesting in the case of Sir David. Look what happened. His local Muslim constituents were appalled at what happened. They loved him. They saw that he was a supporter of all their causes in that way. But that didn't stop him, seemingly being mown down, if you like, by...
Well, this person came from a different area, though, didn't they?
Exactly. But it's not, but this, the view, Sir David would have been liked by many Muslims across the UK in this sort of way, given what he had done. So this is not about a particular community. It is about extreme versions of religion and people coming forward to attack. Now, you mentioned online. There are things you can do. For example, Germany has enforced a policy where it does not allow Holocaust denial on online platforms in Germany. Now, you can ask, well, the companies aren't German. How do they do that? They simply have an agreement. They say to them, if you don't abide by this, we will shut you down and we will stop you working.
Yes, because I know Australia did something to Facebook and Facebook weren't happy about it.
Correct. But they paid up, yes.
If countries work as a mass and hunt as a pack, then we could get some changes online.
That's the key thing. So, if we do it on our own, we're going to end up sort of, not not being successful in terms of changing those attitudes. But collectively, and this is clearly a problem that affects many different societies, we do have the power to force and compel social media companies, which are private companies at the end of the day, but have to work with our support and the support of our governments to gain their markets to do this. And by the way, if you want to see how this works the other way, look at how they are susceptible to pressure from authoritarian regimes. The Russians and the Chinese tell them, stop putting certain apps up on your app store. And what happens? They comply. They comply immediately.
Do you think we're just being lily-livered, Alan? Thank you
so.
so much for joining us. That's Alan Mendoza. He's the director for the Henry Jackson Society.